and good morning to all of you, and thank you for inviting me. And it's been an interesting morning listening to some of the points, and I thought I'd probably just try and add to the conversation on two dimensions. One is sharing our own perspectives and some of my personal observations on how we approach financial literacy in India and my honest opinion on what works and what doesn't work. And the second is some observations around the specific positioning of the NPS APY within the range of potential offerings in terms of long-term savings and security and how that fits. But first on literacy, there are broadly, and I've encountered, there are three sources, if you like, through which we undertake this. One, of course, is obligations placed on regulators who have a developmental as well as supervisory role. The second is activities undertaken by institutions themselves, manufacturers, participants, industry associations, and so on. And the third is initiatives undertaken by intermediaries and distributors. All of this, of course, ultimately has to ride on the obvious truth that ultimately financial literacy, as CP was saying, is part of a broader index of development, and it can't be dissociated from issues related to education, income security, health, and so on. And there's no point pretending that a country can develop disproportionately rapidly on the dimension of financial literacy while actually lacking on several other elements of index. But since we're not here to have a social science class, I will just leave that as an obvious point, that we have to be realistic as to how financial literacy will develop as part of the index of development. But having said that, coming back to those three approaches, of course, regulators have a legitimate role in promoting literacy, but the practical experience of doing this is that it is, frankly, whether it's been the RBI, SEBI, IRDA, and of course PFRDA is the new kid on the block, I think if one did an objective assessment, I would come to the conclusion, and I will not place this burden on anyone else, that this has been of marginal effectiveness. Why is this of marginal effectiveness? First of all, it is essentially a form of transmission, if you like. It's not a conversation. Regulators typically don't engage in conversations. They issue things. They issue guidelines. They issue directives. They issue circulars. They exhort. They direct sometimes. And frankly, I mean, I think all of us who have been through any form of education and learning know from a behavioral point of view, the psychological effectiveness of such approaches is fairly minimal. You know, if you want a population control program, putting up hoardings which say, "Do ya teen bache bas," is not as effective as ultimately either having an educated population or, of course, you know, Sanjay Gandhi's methods, which I don't approve of, but they were more effective than having billboards which essentially said, "Do ya teen bache bas." And regulators essentially do the "Do ya teen bache bas" type of financial literacy. And I'm caricaturing it deliberately, but I think if we are honest with ourselves, and if we actually examine, and I have had 25 years or more of interaction, and I have the greatest respect for regulators in all parts of the world, it is actually a fairly ineffective source of spreading literacy. The second is financial institutions themselves. Of course, I represent one, and of course, we are proud of things that we may have done. We've done things like Swatantra and so on. But obviously, that too has its limitations, because at the end of the day, the temptation to promote literacy in parallel with the underlying objectives that we have is always going to be a very real temptation. So if I am given an investor education incentive as an insurance company or an asset manager or a bank, or for that matter, an auto manufacturer trying to promote green emissions, in all cases, I think all of us will observe from our own experience, there will be some amount of creep and expansion into promotion of products which tends to take over, no matter how hard we try, and I don't put ourselves on a pedestal from this, although we make sincere efforts. But since I'm trying to be objective here, I would say that has had some amount of effect. I think it's a bit more effective than what regulators do. So if I would give regulators a 3 out of 10, I would perhaps give this a 5 out of 10 in terms of the potential cumulative impact of such initiatives. But that's not really been supremely effective either. The third sort of, the third area where, of course, literacy and so on gets proactively developed is through the activity of intermediaries. And intermediaries come in various shapes and sizes, not just distributors or agents as we think of them. Could be other sources of influence, influencers, could be family, could be associations, corporate linkages, frankly, community linkages, and so on. But this is essentially a form where, through association and intermediation, you have a process of peer learning actually taking place, sometimes incentivized commercially, sometimes not incentivized in a very direct way commercially. The process of intermediation is by far the most impactful process by which what we call literacy, as CP defined it, which is an understanding of your life goals and how to use financial products to align against them. Why? Because it represents the highest level of validation often that we are able to gauge. If I take an imperfect analogy, when we talk of medical literacy, for example, do I need to be medically literate or do I need to be medically aware? How medically literate do I need to be? Is it sufficient to know which doctors to go to or which sources of information to seek? I'm obviously not aiming to substitute for the doctor or the clinical expertise per se, but it's very important for me to have a level of trust, if you like, which helps me discover how to go about actually getting the access to the medical treatment that I need. And I think this is something that we have continuously underestimated. In the West, this is described as the problem of advice, that as you essentially drive costs out of financial products, one of the things that tends to get compressed in that process is the whole process of advice. And I think you, as policymakers, one has to have a fairly clear view around whether advice matters or it doesn't matter. And you can't divorce that notion from literacy. The entire population of 1.2 billion Indians are not going to become financial experts. That is frankly, to my mind, a fatuous goal. No more so than 1.2 billion Indians are going to become clinically literate in that sense. I hope they will be medical aware. I hope they will be concerned about their wellness and health and education and so on. Similarly, I hope we will have financial awareness, but you are always going to have a need for advice, and that is how literacy actually gets spread. And I think one of the risks that we have with the way we are currently trying to develop the retail financial sector in India, and I think NPS too has to consider this, is in this whole process, where will advice come to bring its force? It can come through, of course, the kind of programs Sandeep was talking about. It can come through, I think Mr. Mishra said he doesn't like to use the word selling, use subscribing, call it anything you like. But somebody needs to be engaged in the activity in a way that is sustainable of actually bringing people the kind of services that they need. And I think that's something which, if I look at the NPS product, that is a gap that exists today. As a fund manager, of course, we're paid 1 basis point. You pay 25 basis points to a point of purchase, which is amortized over, let's say, 25 years. That's another basis point. We pay something to a CRA and maybe another 6-7 basis points to other agencies. So all in all, I think, and I could be a little bit off here, you're paying somewhere in the region of 10 or 12 basis points. It is a very low-cost product. And I think, as was said in the morning, probably one of the lowest cost pension products in the world, which is creditable. But in that process, you're going to have to make two choices. One, if you want this to be delivered to the economically vulnerable sections of society, then you should have the APY scheme and you should mandate it. Auto-enrollment is the only answer. If the policymakers have decided that this is a product that is good for you, and we want you to have it, and the definition of you is an economically vulnerable section of society, then we should stop beating about the bush and go for an automatic enrollment policy. Everybody should simply be enrolled in the product. There's a cost to the government of doing that, but we know how to do that. We've done that with Jan Dhan, we've done that with Aadhaar. And when we have wanted to, we have got that done. But for the broader segments of society who perhaps, and whatever may be your definition of not economically vulnerable, there, of course, you have to continue with market-led solutions. And again, as a player that has NPS and other products and so on, there's a range of products that people can suit themselves for building a pension. For example, I could offer at 11 basis points an index product, a nifty index product, which is also, of course, exempt from capital gains if held. Emanates from that unfortunate, I should say, the root cause of some of that confusion is a regulatory and governance structure which is still unresolved from the point of view of the common investor. Because I should not have to worry about whether in a particular tax year, X product has managed to squeeze through in the budget a minor advantage that I now have to track versus Y product. I should be able to think about this on a common platform and common regulation. So if we are to have financial literacy, I would essentially sum up my observation is this will be driven through the encouragement by whatever means of a strong body of intermediation. Of course, intermediaries need regulation and so on, but without that, I don't think a country like India will really build financial literacy. And two, we will need to have mandated outcomes with auto-enrollment at its heart for welfare-driven participation and market-led solutions with common regulatory platforms for everybody else. And I think we will then build a financially aware and sustainable society. So